Well, we certainly have been on a bit of an odyssey, these last several generations in particular. And in fact, there would be good reason to think that in 2012, we really at a high water mark in human history in terms of the life possibilities for people with disabilities. That in many ways, the progress that we've experienced would have been inconceivable if we had kind of turned the clock back to the 1950s. We've really come a great distance in a couple of generations. And that's not something that's guaranteed. One can set out on the Odyssey thinking, well, it'll go in our favor. But many of the pioneers, and many of which were families, really had no guarantees when they set out on the Odyssey. They simply had needs and necessities and hope, and in the process have brought us to this moment of 2012, where we can honestly say much has been achieved. And the things that have been achieved are not insignificant. They're very deeply significant, and for which we should have great gratitude for all of these pioneers and leaders and advocates, many of whom will be nameless and unknown, but nonetheless were part of the complex process of changing the world we live in. And this wasn't simply restricted to one nation or one people, but many peoples. And of course, in 2012, we're now really a part of a very difficult to grasp movement that cuts across country after country. And yet, in many ways, this movement is pushing us in very similar directions. Now, the good news is we have accomplished a great deal. The bad news is there's still lots to be done. So both things can be true. We can be grateful that we've made headway, but we would have to be very intimidated by what lies ahead. There's a great many challenges that we face today, one of which, interestingly enough, is that the clock can be turned backwards. So all that has been gained can be taken back and can be reversed because we have no guarantees that the ground gained will always be kept. And if we don't have the next generation of leaders to do that, then we will have accomplished a great deal that then we'll have to regain at some point. But let's start really with what began all this, and that is that if there's no vision for a good life, there really is no achieving of a good life. And so the beginnings of a good life sort of begin in what we're willing to open ourselves up to. If we're closed off, there can be no good life, there can be no progress, the Odyssey goes nowhere. But if we're open to what could be, even if it seems very difficult to achieve, even if it's remote, even if it's fraught with challenges, then there's always the possibility we may get there. And in that sense, the beginning of all this has been the willingness to build a vision, to hold a vision long before the great majority of people have it. And that's the nature of people that pioneer, that they're willing to believe something long before it is possible and practical for great numbers. And one of the things, of course, is that people with disabilities have not been looked upon as desirable human beings. And that challenge still sits with us, but we've been able to shift that considerably since the last couple of generations to the point where today we wouldn't, if you're in the 50s again, you wouldn't recognize public attitudes today and the openness of communities to people with disabilities and the shifts, both profound and subtle, that have been achieved by people constantly challenging negative attitudes and beliefs and assumptions and perceptions, all of which have opened up then the ability of people with disabilities to be seen as fully human and to have lives and opportunities similar to other people. And that work continues, of course, but it's clear we've made headway. Secondly, disability itself is better understood in this era. There were all sorts of stereotypes, myths, misperceptions, false information, and so on that we've had to challenge over these decades. And we would have to say we've clarified a number of those stereotypes We've challenged them, we've replaced them with more positive understandings. The work continues, but it is important to understand that the public, which is all of us, of course, can be educated and can change their mind, even if we're dragged kicking and screaming to the insights. We are still nonetheless able to be influenced. And why I say that is many people think, oh, it's a fool's errand to try to change attitudes and beliefs and misinformation, but this is simply not the case. That people do come to see the value of more correct insights about people. And so in this sense, it's not a waste of energy. It's in fact paid off considerably. And as I said about vision, the families and the advocates of the earlier periods in this recent movement, and by the way, we can't find a movement like this movement at any other point in history. There may have been one in prehistory, but we simply can't really find anything like this last couple of generations at any point in time. So in that sense, we're definitely breaking ground because we don't really have a kind of a precedent, other than possibly some movements related in mental health in what we would call the moral treatment era, but it was really not as significant as what's been achieved in this arena. And a lot of this has come from the idea of vision, and vision being the willingness to imagine what life would look like if things were better, if they were done as they should be done, if people lived as they should live. And that vision is not something simply an exercise of creating it, it's also a question of holding to it and to continue to evolve it. Because the vision that people have no conviction about is vision that nobody will do anything about. So it's a test of us to remain convinced and to convince others that the vision is possible. A good example of this would be simply the fact that the people with disabilities, as you can see in some of the topics in this conference, are able to have a home of their own, they're able to have jobs of their own, they're able to have a place in all of the different corners of society. Each of those is a test of vision, but it's also a test of whether people believe it and whether they're prepared to act on it and pay a price for the vision. Vision without conviction is very easy to obtain. You can read just the rhetoric of one bureaucracy after another. All the words are in proper order. But one senses from time to time that they lack conviction about doing something about it. And so in this sense, vision is not really very meaningful or very potent until people, in a sense, make a commitment to it and act as if the vision is deserving of their commitment. And in this process, we have taken people that have been disenfranchised by their society and now have endowed them with the rights that all other people have had in instance after instance. And we forget this, but each of those legal and moral and rights victories, somebody had to fight for those to get the doors open, to challenge the practices. And now there may be a tendency to take for granted that these rights are present, because there would be people in this room that couldn't remember when those rights weren't present, weren't respected, and we still have many rights that are simply not in place at this point, but we do have at least the benefit of all the progress in achieving what's been achieved to date. Of course, a good example would be the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is the most recent of those victories. But it's really a victory in the beginning. There's much to be tested in the convention in the years ahead, but at least we have a convention to feel challenged by. A few years ago, we didn't have that convention, so in that sense, in a small way, the agenda's moved ahead. There was a time when there was really no support available to families in any meaningful way. And today, one of our great complaints is how many services there are and how confusing it is to access them and this and that. But at least now we have services to be annoyed about. I can remember when there was nothing to be annoyed about and all we had was great emptiness in all directions. Now we have emptiness, but proliferating in a new way. So we should be grateful that we're disappointed in so many surprising new ways that weren't there in previous times. And we've worked to get to this disappointment. We should cling to it. It's surely we've certainly earned it. But we really do have resources, an inventory of resources in country after country that have been built up really as an asset for people with disabilities over the last couple of generations. And that asset, doesn't work to our liking, of course, in every instance. But if we can transform that asset into what it could and should be, then the building up of it has been worthwhile. Also, one of the great accomplishments in family advocacy, and now in its very mature phase here in New South Wales, is an example that we have had sustained independent advocacies of all kinds, both informal and formal. And again, we forget just how remarkable that is, that we have organizations and people that simply stick up for other people, because we didn't have that for most of our history, and now we do have it. And it is a great triumph that there are people willing to stand up and advocate, but it's also a triumph that people are listening to the advocates. Advocates that aren't listened to would be a great thing in one way, in the sense that we have them, but we also have advocates that have been influential because people respect what the advocate is saying. Whether that be a parent or be a paid advocate or something, really doesn't matter. We have had advocacy in a society that has been welcoming of advocacy and dissent and things of that kind. So we should be grateful that we're not arrested for our advocacy as we might be in other times and places. There may still be time to get arrested. Don't give up hope. I'm sure there'll be a line you will cross. But we have to, the very fact that we don't get arrested is a sign really of a tolerance for dissent and for a challenge and advocacy. And again, we should be grateful that the price that we pay for advocacy isn't as extreme as it might be in other contexts. And also the improved opportunity for people to occupy roles of all kinds in community life. Just when we think we've seen everything, there'll be a new example of some person with a disability in a role that we've rarely seen people in. And again, these roles appear not by accident, but by intent. That behind every one of those stories, someone had said, this is a breakthrough, this is a new landmark, a new kind of level we've risen to. And each story, in a sense, has been incremental contributors to our overall progress. And each of these is essentially summarized in a human being in a valued social role that they had not previously occupied. And in this sense, just the large numbers of people with disabilities that you see now in advertising, be an example of something we never saw before. And that really, again, isn't accidental, it's very intentional. But it does respect the fact that we have made progress on social inclusion. And in fact, when you look at Western societies, you see people with disabilities in every possible location in communities. Everywhere you turn, you'll find someone with a disability to the point where it's unremarkable. But there are many societies I travel in, it's almost impossible to actually see a person with a disability in ordinary life in communities because they're hidden away somewhere or they never got to live in that society. And we forget that. We forget that what has now become normative physical presence of people has been a landmark achievement, particularly in the West, but increasingly in many other societies. And of course, people with disabilities are still with us, which is a great accomplishment. The lifespan of people with disabilities in the last 2 generations has increased. That the life expectancy has kept up with society at large, who has also increased their life expectancy. And part of that is access to good opportunities for health care and support and for education and things of this sort. Of course, being able to live for some time is associated with having a good life. in case you're worried about that. Having a lot of years to take advantage of life isn't something we should treat as a trivial accomplishment. So in this sense, there'd be families in this room who were told that their family member wouldn't live till they were 20, and now they're sort of pushing 60 and 70, and you want to go back and throttle someone who said that they wouldn't be around. But it is really a kind of important collective accomplishment that's happened. Also, that families are not alone anymore. There's all kinds of inventive and resourceful ways families are supported. And since families bear the greatest burden of responsibility lifelong, incessantly for the support of people with disabilities, it is only sensible that people support families. If families can't make it, society can't do much. So in this sense, sustaining families is a hugely practical, sensible option, and to the extent that we've done that, we have much to be grateful for, because it means that the responsibilities of support and so on aren't kind of disproportionately held by families, but that there is others that are coming to assist in some form or fashion. We should be grateful that our institutions aren't the institutions that we saw in the 50s and 60s. We still have institutions today, but we call them today mini institutions or custodial settings. But they're a very different kind of institutional kind of character to them today. And again, that's not accidental. We've essentially tried to eliminate institutionalization, and in the process we haven't done that, but we have really changed the nature of it so that it's a very different kind of institutional challenge that we have in 2012 from when I can recall. The institutions of my youth are very, very different from what we now think of as institutional. We also have a community that extends well beyond families, that is involved in the process of welcoming and including and supporting people with disabilities in very subtle and unnoticed ways in many cases. But once we start paying attention, we realize that the community has been with us on many, many matters. Not with a gun to their head, but simply because it now makes sense to them that people with disabilities are part of what they do, whether it's a leisure thing or some other kind of activity. And that kind of welcome really is a civilizing kind of welcome, because it has meant then that people with disabilities simply are much more comfortable and hospitably received in countless places. So that hospitality and welcome is real. There would be a politically correct element to it, of course, in many instances, but people quickly lose that as they move on. A good example of this would be employment. There are now jurisdictions in the world that have 7 out of 10 people with a disability in a regular job in the community. Again, it would be inconceivable a few generations back, but if you think of that as one employer, one employment setting at a time, to go from 10 or 15% employment to 70% in a 25 or 30-year period, something's going on besides advocacy. Because the employers could always say, it's not on, you're not welcome here, and that's not been what's happening. And it is true that that's not widely the case, that you'd have numbers of that kind, but of course once you have a 70% type number, you know at some point there'll be another jurisdiction with 70% and another jurisdiction later with 80%, because it's building upon the precedent of what had come before us. And whether it's Australia or any other country, it's a clue that there is a reservoir of hospitality that can be tapped into, but we have to appreciate that it's there and start to work with it. And when we treat the community as if they're ever hostile to our purposes, we're shooting ourselves in the foot, because clearly there is something there to be worked with. Even in surprising individuals can be quite hospitable. And also the levels of achievement of people with disabilities in education and not just employment, but education in schools and now into higher education is very, very interesting, because again, that would have been inconceivable 20 years ago, but now we have tertiary institutions that are welcoming people with disabilities, and not just in a few instances. Now we have dozens and dozens of examples of these. So these are all signs of the fact that the efforts that we've been making have not been unrewarded. But we do have some continuing challenges. I'll mention a few of them. And challenges of these kinds are, of course, in a sense, partly because we've got to where we are. We've almost created some new challenges for ourselves. So in this sense, it's a bit like dilemmas. You can't resolve a dilemma without creating another dilemma. So in a sense, thank God we have these dilemmas, because otherwise we have the old dilemmas. And it's always good to have a fresh dilemma, you know, just like it's good to get rid of the X, you know, at some point. The X dilemma, sorry. So, and that's really progress in a way. Progress brings us into new challenges, but the new challenges are not a sign that we're not going to continue to make progress. And certainly the social devaluation of people with disabilities is very real and very subtle and very difficult to root out in our society. But sadly, across the Western societies as well as into many non-Western societies, the vast millions of new parents are choosing not to have a child with a disability and are aborting that child as soon as it's detected. And while we talk about how we're in favor of people with disabilities getting a life, but you see, not getting born, it does have some implications for a good life. And it also indicates that there is a great deal of work to be done, that people do not want to bring a disabled child into the world suggests that we're not done, that we have a very deep threshold of openness and rejection and devaluation that we've yet to really put our hands on. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these high rates of choosing to not have people with disabilities even get to be born. And that's very frightening, because it's reminiscent of a very dark side of our nature that has been with us throughout history. So while we've made headway, it's sitting there and still will need a lot of attention in the years to come. And families still have a very hard time of it. When I see families in very advanced age still doing what they did 40 and 50 years ago in terms of responsibilities, with no one really at their side, you realize that there are limits to what we've created in and around families. And so anyone who thinks that we're out of the woods on that question is simply not paying attention to the lived day-to-day realities of families, the struggles and the isolation and the insane kind of way that families get treated by bureaucratic systems, and on and on. This is not a pretty picture, and it's a really shameful thing in many ways, but it is our challenge, and we're going to simply have to do better with that. Also, our service systems are strikingly incompetent and ineffectual. We've had employment services now for decades, and the employment rate barely moves in many jurisdictions. After literally tens of millions of dollars spent on getting people jobs, there are no jobs for them. They're in some kind of day custody program to this moment. And it's just often work image day custody, but nonetheless, we still have it. And so this is just a symptom of the uselessness of many services. They really aren't achieving the kind of vision and potential that we've asked them to achieve. There are many reasons for it. It's certainly not for lack of trying in many instances, but to have all these assets of services, community services, underperforming is deeply distressing. We have so few resources. To have them offer some of the best ideas of the 1970s in 2012 is just absolutely distressing, because there really isn't an updating and a rethinking and transformation of these. So we'll have to kind of take up that challenge as we have. Now, the exception would be wherever you live, the services are good. I'm always talking about some other community. And of course, I always like to read the annual reports of agencies as they describe themselves as moving from one staggering triumph to another. And of course, all that kind of talk really just cloaks and covers the reality that in terms of performance, we could expect a lot more and we should expect a lot more, but we're going to have to be much more thoughtful about how we use those assets and how we transform them. I wouldn't want us to think that the solution is simply to be annoyed at service providers. That would be too easy. We really have to be much more fundamental in thinking that question through as advocates and as many other things. Publius Syrus, many of you probably don't know him, he's been dead for some time now, a Roman writer, but he was a very astute guy that sort of says things that are valid through time, and he says anyone can hold the helm when the sea is calm. So when we think of challenges, as long as the challenges are easy, we're all triumphant. But the minute challenges get hard, the queue of people that want to deal with them kind of gets short. You think, oh, everybody will want to do this. You turn around, you're the only one at the party. Because it is difficult, it is tempestuous, it is frightening, and so taking up these challenges is a test of a kind. And one of the tests we're going to have to take up is just how many people spend their lives day wasting, day after day after day, that the difference from one day, from one year to the next is very, very little. And when you look at the biographies of people with disabilities who could have done so much more with their life, and their life is really a routine of care, custody, and maintenance, but very little growth, very little development, very little excitement, very little glamour, very little to look forward to, we realize there's a kind of emptiness in that we're going to need to address. It's not that we can't address it, but we're simply going to have to name it before we solve it. And this kind of massive new institutionalization, which I call custodialization of people, really is going to be quite a formidable challenge. We now have institutions for one, something that would have been unheard of, but now we have them, and they're very expensive, and they're very damaging, and apparently they aren't supposed to exist because everybody's so person-centered and everything. But we are doing a very good job of disappointing people one at a time. We don't need to do it in groups anymore. We can do it with a person-centered plan right in your community. So I guess that's progress. And we do really have to rebalance these service systems. They're serving agendas and bureaucracies, agendas that are really out of balance with what is needed, the tacit and implicit agendas. In a sense, the systems have become feral. They were set up to do one thing, and they've kind of gone off and did something else, and they have to be brought back to the purposes that they were founded to do. And this is a very big challenge because now they're big. They're massive, they're complex. We've never managed these things before in human history, and they've got away from us. We've got to figure out where we went wrong with that and figure out strategies to rebalance, refashion, remake, and transform services and systems. And again, it seems like a fool's errand that it can't be done, but we have to make the assumption it can be done. And of course, when we do, we see that actually, in fact, some people are making progress with this issue. Maybe doing that in a world in which the economic resources, which have been growing over the last couple of generations, may diminish. It's not clear that that's going to be the case, but growth has limits in economic terms, and we're seeing an economic period where in many countries now people are dealing with less than they had 4 or 5 years ago in terms of public resources. And if that kind of trend continues, then we have to learn to manage other than growth. We're going to have to learn to do better with less resources, and that's a very different challenge than simply adding resources, solving all problems with new monies. we may have to go back into the base budgets and resources and rethink fundamentally how we do things because we're in a much more stressed sort of economic picture than we've had in recent times. Now, I can't predict the future, but in many ways, why would we expect that we'd have more resources year in, year out? Things that go up do come down again, and so in that sense, it requires a very different kind of leadership. We also have a generation of leaders, the baby boom generation, that are soon not going to be with us. For whatever reason, the years have caught up with them, and we now have an unplanned transition from the baby boom generation of leaders to a younger generation of leaders. It's been a very poorly handled transition. And we don't know what the effects of that are, but a lack of planning, a lack of thoughtful preparation for a change that was inevitable is now upon us. We're in the middle of that change, and we have young people coming up and a disconnect with historical processes of leadership development and so on, and who knows what the implications of that will be. We also have, as I said earlier, a responsibility to protect what we've developed for fear that it could be rolled back, we could lose it. Societies have collapsed in previous times in history, regimes and systems. We have no guarantee that the ground we've gained we can keep. And so in this sense, if it gets tough enough, are people going to roll the clock back? Because in other times and places that has happened. So are we ready to defend the ground that we've captured, or are we going to take it for granted only to have it quickly taken in a crisis? And while we are now part of community, everybody would recognize that the depth of relationship, the depth of attachment to community, the seriousness of belongingness is really quite dubious in many instances. And we really have a challenge of getting more authentic, more real, and who knows where that goes, but we would like it to be real, but is it? And how do we kind of solve the problem of authenticity? All of these problems and challenges are kind of intimidating to people. I certainly find them intimidating, but of course I'll be gone soon because I'm a baby boomer. So good luck, folks, with the mess we've left you. I mean, who can look a 20-year-old in the eye anymore? I mean, what could they be idealistic about with, peak oil and collapsing environment, the economy's gone to hell, there's no future. There is the Olympics. So who knows? But one of the things that we can understand is it's a miracle we did anything either with all the challenges that we faced. So in this sense, it's very important to remain hopeful with the next generation about what is possible, as dark and as grim as it looks at times. What has sustained people through all these years is hope. And hope is not a foolish concept. Hope is a very meaningful concept. It has sustained people through much difficulty in century after century. And so in this sense, not only do we have challenges, but we must have hope as we face those challenges. If there is a key message that leaders must bring, it is that I have not given up hope. I may not be optimistic, as Wolfensberger used to say, but I am deeply hopeful. So if you want sort of job number one is get hopeful, and then go have a look at some of these challenges and see what interests you. Thank you.